So Cole, you'll be ready to start taping, to start recording.
Yeah, we're live. You can go ahead.
Okay. So welcome, everybody. On behalf of the Campaign for Peace, Disarmament, and Common Security, and on behalf of the Ukraine Peace Campaign of Massachusetts Peace Action, let me welcome all of you to this afternoon's webinar. What in the world is going on in Europe? And what are the implications of dramatic developments going on there for our peace movement here? To figure things out, we are fortunate to have with us today Kate Hudson and Joseph Gerson. Let me just note that for those of you who have not yet heard, Reiner Braun, our original panelist, has to send his regrets as he is called away to speak with a number of EU parliamentarians on peace issues, unfortunately, at this very time. Kate will be speaking to us from England, and Joseph, who is just back from the NATO Counter Summit at The Hague, will be speaking to us directly from the great city of Watertown, Massachusetts. Kate Hudson is a British political activist and academic and vice president of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, the CND, and co-national secretary of Left Unity. She has served as CND chair, general secretary from 2010 to 2024, and as an officer of the Stop the War Coalition, which many of us, of course, are quite familiar with. She is a board member of the International Peace Bureau. So this is someone we have to hear from as we figure out how we might respond to these big changes going on in Europe. Joseph Gerson is the president of the Campaign for Peace, Disarmament, and Common Security after serving as peace secretary of the American Friends Service Committee here in Cambridge for 40 or more years. As mentioned, he is just back from the NATO Counter Summit in the Netherlands. Before working at American Friends Service Committee, Joseph lived in Europe and has long worked with European peace movement leaders and scholars. These days, he is the primary contact between the United States peace movement and peace movements around the world. Today, we are fortunate to have him between flights to various continents to continue his lifelong work promoting a world based on social justice and peace. So let us begin with Kate. Kate, thank you so much for joining us today.
Many thanks, Paul, and thank you for inviting me. Couldn't be a more topical subject, really, at a time when the world and all our continents are facing huge challenges. Of course, the big issue at the moment that everyone's talking about in Europe is last week's NATO summit. As you know, it was agreed that NATO member states would now have to spend 5% on the military by 2035. And this, for all of them, is a massive, massive increase on what they're already spending. This is a target which has been very, very strongly pushed by President Trump. You can imagine he described the outcome as a great victory. He's been saying, certainly in his first term, he said it already, that Europe should pay for Europe's defense and Europe should deal with Russia. Many people, many commentators believe that this is to free the United States up to confront China. So Europe deals with Russia and the United States deals with China. There are other motivations, of course, it appears, on Trump's part. So, for example, after having said it was a great victory, he then said that he hoped the spending increase would be spent on US military hardware. The 5% target is divided into 3.5%, which has to be spent on core defense, which is military hardware and other directly military products. 1.5%, the remaining part, is to be spent on what's called resilience, whatever that is, and security. And this can include infrastructure, it can include security services. In the UK, of course, MI5 and MI6, we've got parallels in all countries. So a really massive escalation. Europe has been very largely craven to President Trump on this question. Mark Rutte, the NATO Secretary General, I don't know if this was reported in the States, but he described Trump as daddy, projecting him as a global patriarch. And really, it's quite, well, people were deeply appalled and shocked that the kind of sycophantic language that he used towards Trump. The only real opposition in Europe came from Spain, which refused to agree to spending that much. Their Prime Minister, Pedro Sanchez, was then threatened by Trump with a tougher trade deal. He said he'd make them pay twice as much in tariffs than the countries that acquiesced to the Trump demands. There was also some opposition from Belgium and Slovenia, I believe, or Slovakia. Sorry, I can't remember which one, but they did also acquiesce. So Spain is really the only standout against the massive drive to militarization. The key motivation for European leaders was to keep Trump on board with NATO. There's been a kind of great anxiety amongst them that he will pull the plug, that he'll leave NATO. But they were reassured because the summit confirmed its continuing commitment to Article 5 of the NATO Treaty on Collective Security. So there'd been some anxiety that Trump would pull out of that and leave the Europeans to their own devices. So they've got that assurance for now, but of course, I'm sure Trump could change his mind at any time. And of course, there is this massive cost to it. So in terms of Europe's big economies, Germany will increase military spending by more than 2/3 by 2029. So that's, they currently spend 2.4% of GDP. That will be up to 3.5% by 2029. France will increase from 2% now to between 3.5% by 2030. And Britain, which is currently on 2.4%, will rise to 4.1% by 2027. So that's 2 years. So it seems to us to be an impossible and very, very damaging agreement. And indeed, the militarization of Europe overall is very alarming, not only in terms of military spending and policies and war engagement, but also the kind of propagandization around war and increasing militarization drives in schools and universities. There's also a nuclear increase too, nuclear weapons. Britain has agreed to buy 12 F-35A jets from the United States. These are nuclear capable and will use the American B-61-12s from the US arsenal in Europe. So there's nuclear proliferation on the part of Britain, and of course escalation, because not only does this put Britain at greater risk, it also makes Britain a greater danger and a greater threat elsewhere in the world. So that's a kind of a profile for Britain that many of us are resisting. Big question, of course, is where will the money come from? And of course, it is a lot of money. They're not likely to increase taxes on the rich to pay for it. So it's clearly going to come from cuts to social spending. So in Britain, international aid has already been slashed to pay for part of the initial increase. The government is already cutting support for disabled people, for pensioners, and for poor families. So alongside the militarization and the ramping up to war, we'll also see increasing social decay and leading, of course, to social tension. The UK government has also last week published a national security strategy, a new national security strategy, which has an emphasis on what they call a whole society. I'm just going to move my fan because it's making my probably just get hot now instead, but anyway, never mind. So a whole society approach to security, the interlinking of the defense industry, so-called, and economic development, emphasis on sovereign capability, so making more goods at home, more military products at home, controlling supply chains, and of course, winning people to the myth that military spending boosts the economy, jobs, and so on. And you don't need me to explain to you how that is not true. So this is what's happening in Britain. It's happening elsewhere across the European continent. And of course, another side of this, another angle, is that the more you push militarization within a society and a kind of warmongering attitude, building other countries up into enemies, so-called, the more nationalism you get. And then with that, you also tend to get the rise of the far right. And that is something we are also seeing across Europe. Varies from country to country, but that is a developing phenomenon. So how are the peace movements responding to these developments? Well, I would say that the peace movements, specifically the peace movements in Europe, are generally unified, and they're good on all key issues. Opposition to NATO and military spending, very strong on that, as we saw in The Hague last week. We're also pretty much unified around the welfare, not warfare slogan. So in terms of challenging the government spending on the military, welfare, not warfare, is a unifying slogan. There's a new initiative called Stop Rearm. Rearm was the initial title given to the kind of Europe-wide military spending project. So Stop Rearm is pulling together a lot of civil society organizations and campaigns. That's very good. We're all pretty much united on the need for ceasefire and peace in Ukraine, an end to the war there without insisting on having a military victory. So that's a very common thread, although, of course, there are some on the left who don't share that view. But I'm talking about the peace movement specifically. We're pretty united on that. We're all against the war on Iran. I don't need to explain why. I'm sure you will probably share those same views. And of course, very fundamentally, we're against genocide in Gaza, and we are for Palestinian sovereignty. So I would say that the movement in Europe is pretty united on all the key and fundamental issues. That doesn't mean we have an easy time of it, in terms of building support or in terms of winning hearts and minds to our perspectives. And it certainly doesn't mean we have an easy time in terms of winning governments to our perspectives. But we do have some very fantastic mobilizations. Of course, not entirely, but largely the biggest mobilizations are for Gaza. I say not entirely because at the weekend there was a massive demonstration in Rome against the rearmament of Europe. So there are some strong mobilizations against the rearmament, but the really big mobilizations are for Gaza. Certainly in Britain, we regularly have hundreds of thousands on the streets against the genocide. But then if we're mobilizing around opposition to NATO or opposition to the war in Iran, much fewer numbers. So I think obviously Gaza is a very special case. People are rightly very moved on a humanitarian basis about the suffering in Gaza and the rights of the Palestinians. But obviously we're working to engage the population on issues like NATO, Iran, and Ukraine. So people may be less engaged directly with those issues, but by and large, UK public opinion is in its majority against war and certainly against the genocide. And I saw recent very interesting polling. I can't remember the exact details, but basically the majority thinks that the United States is the most dangerous global threat. Iran was right down in the kind of single figures in the polling, but the US is seen as the most dangerous global threat. One of the challenges we're facing at the moment is attacks on the right to protest. This is, I think, occurring in a number of countries, but very strongly we're facing this in Britain. There have been huge attempts or significant attempts by government to restrict, through new legislation, to restrict our kind of freedom to demonstrate for Gaza. So that's the kind of political motivating factor around some of the limitations, but also, of course, there have been very long sentences given for non-violent direct action taken by environmental activists. Some environmental activists are in prison for many years, resulting from NVDA. I suppose what's new is the harsh restrictions on peaceful so-called A to B marches, which is pretty much unprecedented. And then in the last week, we've seen Palestine Action, which is a direct action organization which takes action against weapons factories that are making weapons for the Israeli military and against planes and military facilities being used to support the Israeli military. They tend to do actions against those, and our government is now in the process of proscribing them as a terrorist organization. So that's a very new departure. In fact, many people in the Home Office, the civil service, lawyers, and all sorts are saying how absurd it is that a direct action organization should be, which is, undertaking diverse campaigning methods for a political goal, that they should be put in the kind of terrorist kind of descriptor. So that's the kind of ongoing challenges that we face. And then finally, what we maybe not expectations for peace activists in the States exactly, but maybe what is our perception and what are we hoping for. I was saying to your organizers of this Zoom earlier on before the meeting started how much Mamdani has inspired people here in Britain, watching his victory in that kind of first round was quite extraordinary, and also the power of his speech, and the inclusivity and the directness of his words were very inspiring and really something of a lesson to us, you know, because we've got lots of problems here. Lots of people don't like the government. Lots of people want to do something different, but we seem to be pretty incapable of getting some kind of coherent political opposition together. You know, there's the problem with the Labour government. Well, anyway, but you know, so seeing a new young person coming forward and leading. But what was striking for us in particular also was the way that he was supported by Bernie Sanders, who's the kind of, you know, great state. Well, you may disagree with this, but he seems over here to be like a kind of the great older statesman of the left. So to see that kind of alliance between the generations was very inspiring, because we've got some older leaders here. I mean, of course, we have Jeremy Corbyn, you know, as a kind of elder statesman. We want, you know, support from people like that for a young generation of people coming up with the same principle and the same courage that the older active leaders have. And then finally, I would just say, for all of us, of course, I'm sure unity is absolutely crucial. Unity of movements and initiatives. We tend to have a lot of fragmentation here, which is not good. You know, people building their own thing or disputing over some quite minor issue. And in the peace movement, we're always very keen to build on the broadest basis possible, you know, so we have a kind of common sort of bottom line. I mean, I always refer back to, you know, 20 years ago with the attacks on Iraq. You know, we didn't go into detail about what we thought about Saddam Hussein or the Kurdish question. It was always, don't attack Iraq, you know, and that was the basis on which we could unify. And that's what we're still trying to do, you know, to build unity of movements and initiatives. And I'm sure that's the same kind of priority that you have over there in the United States. And I wish you every success in very, very difficult circumstances. Thank you.
Well, Kate, thank you so much for that comprehensive, very comprehensive overview. And we will have a chance for questions a little later on, as we'll be using the raise hand function. So if people could get your questions ready, but for now, we hope you will turn your attention to Joseph Gerson's presentation. Joe?
So thank you, Kate. That was great. And I trust that people really took in what it was that you shared with us. Needless to say, I'm not Reiner Braun, but I'm going to try to draw on his worldview a little bit, and to say that in the talk I'm going to give here, I'm going to kind of reach into kind of more geopolitics, kind of the global struggles, and draw on both the NATO Counter Summit, but also in the tradition of Sesame Street, where there's which one of these is not the same. I've also been part of a track 2 process with quite senior figures from the United States, Europe, and Russia. And I'll draw a little bit on that as well. So first of all, just in terms of some introductory framing, my take has been that across much of Europe, people and movements there are dealing with 3 dominant stresses: military, economic, and, as Kate was saying, the divisions and pressures from the right. I think we need to understand what's happening in the context of the end of the 500-year period of the rise and domination of the West over the rest of the world. That period is over. And those of us who are, you know, anywhere near my age, the world that we have lived in and experienced is profoundly, profoundly changing. And as a result of these changes, people are feeling disorientations, dislocations, insecurities, and that's certainly been part of what's happened here in the United States as well. And my sense is that, you know, in part, this comes from, obviously, from China's rise, its ability to create a synthesis between Chinese culture and history, but also lessons from the West. The end of colonialism and the emergence of the global South as a geopolitical force. And simply to say, with the end of colonialism, now 50 years, but it's been working its way through in some fundamental ways. That's removed a number of the artificial supports that Europe's wealth and society have had. And we're also are at a period where we have the alienation of the global South and much of the rest of the world from what might be called, Richard Sockwell would call it, evangelical liberalism, in part because of the double standards, the colonial wars, Kate mentioned, support for the Israeli genocide, and the reality of nuclear apartheid. So it's not the world that those of my generation experienced. And since the end of World War II, just to say, since World War II and for Eastern Europe, the post-Soviet period, Europe has really been a protectorate of the United States. Almost, you could say, a neo-colony. If you go back and just to put some of this in context, the first Secretary General of NATO, Lord Hastings, General himself, said that the purpose of NATO was to keep the Russians out, the Germans down, and the U.S. in. And we're seeing this at play again now. Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was Carter's national security advisor and still celebrated. There's a new book about him just come out. He basically described what he called the U.S. imperial project, and drawing on traditional geopolitical theory, the sense that whoever controls the heartland of Eurasia is the world's dominant power. The United States, and before that Britain, as island powers, needed to control Eurasia from the margins. So what we've had really since World War II have been what Brzezinski described as three toeholds on Eurasia: NATO in the West, the Middle East, and even look to Afghanistan, India, Pakistan in the South, the South underbelly, the soft underbelly, and then in the East with the alliances principally with Japan, but otherwise. I think to understand the moment, we need to understand Europe is increasingly being squeezed by great powers. Despite its single market, it can't compete with the US economy or the Chinese economy, although it's trying. Its markets are vulnerable to low-cost Chinese goods. In Germany especially, the loss of cheap Russian energy has risen the cost of production, made their production increasingly uncompetitive, and so therefore impacting German society as a whole. And then we've got Trump's military and tariff pressures on Europe. So Europe as a whole is under quite a bit of pressure. I think at the same time, with this, as Kate was talking about, the massive increases in military spending, European elites are basically trying to do two things. One is to pacify Trump, and the other is to put military structures in place that can offset against Russia in the case of the United States deserting Europe under America First. There's a situation here where France has offered to provide the nuclear umbrella for all of Europe, and the Brits have also sort of signaled in this direction, but it's not being universally celebrated. Where Germany does not exactly want to be that dependent on France, and you have other countries who are less inclined for that. Let me run through a few of the basic lessons from the Track 2 process. I see one of my partners in that process here on the call, and so he can correct me if he wants to in the course of the Q&A. I think first of all, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has cast doubts about Russia's future intentions, right? On the one hand, I'll say that a former very, very senior Pentagon figure here said that NATO totally outguns Russia. And so fears of Russia really are inappropriate. At the same time, in much of Europe right now, basically elites have whipped up a massive fear of Russia. One speaker at the counter summit, said, look, she does understand the anxieties that some of the Balts have, Baltic nations, but there's no way that Russia is about to attack NATO. In the track 2 process, and it's comprised of people who've been arms control negotiators, senior diplomats, analysts, even some military people. What they have in common is they don't want a nuclear war, and their fear has been the loss of strategic stability, understanding across the lines in Europe. And they've been struggling toward ideas about how to create some form of strategic stability in the aftermath of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. There's a sense that the confrontation between the West and NATO is going to be enduring long-term, and fears that if some guardrails aren't established, because they've just been basically all lost, that we face the danger of escalation. And I'm sure many people on this call have been watching that, especially in relationship to the Ukraine war. We're in a situation now where there are no serious negotiations across the West and Russia lines, and there's a sense that there's no possibility of moving toward negotiations for a new European security architecture until we know what the outcome of the Ukraine war is. So everything is in many ways up in the air. What have I got here? Just to complicate things, because I think we need to look at the unhappy truths here as well. In the last session I was in, I asked the Russians how to understand the December 21, January 22 proposals, which basically call for a rollback of NATO, in which former Soviet republics would not be part of NATO, which is to say basically the Baltic nations. And the answer came back that proposal is still on the table, but that we may see it come forward in some of its elements in new ways. So just understand that that's out there. What else do I have from that? And just also to point something we don't think about very much here, the dangers of an incident or an accident in international waters, say in the Baltic Sea or the Black Sea, or even in the Arctic Ocean, triggering an escalation in many of the same ways that we fear might happen on the coast of China. So then, from the NATO counter summit, what I'll do is I draw from remarks of a couple of people and then a few other elements. So Jeremy Corbyn couldn't be there in person because of a vote in Parliament, but he joined us by video. And kind of following what Kate has been saying here, the biggest concern is the level of military spending. Global military spending, as he said, is at $2.7 trillion and going up. For years, the European elites said, well, we don't have money for expanded or even to maintain social services. But all of a sudden, they found all these billions of dollars for remilitarization. And as Kate said, much of that money will be flowing back into U.S. munitions manufacturers. He said that we are in a very dangerous situation, that in many ways, as others have said differently, the current moment has its parallels to the period before World War I. And what he pointed to were the deep and complicated alliance structures, saying that, for example, the EU has an alliance with Saudi Arabia. So it gets interesting and beyond what many of us think about on a daily basis. He pointed to the new reality that we're in a period, not, it's new, but it's ancient, that we're in a period of wars for resources. He pointed to Sudan, the Congo, but we can also think in terms of Trump going for Greenland, Panama, for example. Gaza genocide, as Kate said, has been very much at the center of progressive thinking and manifestations across Europe. I was a little bit surprised in The Hague to see Palestinian flags hanging from shops or in apartment windows. It's very, very, very deep. And he also pointed to the fact that we're approaching the 80th anniversary of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki A bombings. We can say a lot more about that. Pointing to the fact that Israel has refused to join the NPT. And he didn't close, but one of his major points was again, as Kate was saying, the need for us to press for a ceasefire in Ukraine. Some of you will have heard an earlier webinar we did with Peter Mertens. He's a Belgian labor leader and a member of the Belgian parliament. And he was the keynote speaker at the Counter-NATO Summit. Again, he pointed to the 5% increase, which he pointed out does not originate from NATO. It originates from Trump. And he said, this further undermines the legitimacy of this demand and expectations. And again, as Kate was saying, the clear understanding is this is being done so the U.S. can reduce its military commitments to Europe so it can focus on containing China. Well, we're on through here, that's not totally duplicating. Yeah, he also talked a name that really I don't think has penetrated our understanding yet in the U.S. movement. He made reference to Eldridge Colby, who's now #3 in the Pentagon. Colby is the grandson of the former CIA director. And he basically said one of the things that Trump and his company are doing is playing Europe against Asia. So with the 5% pressure for military spending in Europe and with NATO kowtowing, this is in turn is being leveraged by Trump and MAGA in relationship to countries in Asia. Yeah, one of the things that you just heard consistently, the NATO spending is an attack on social spending. And as Kate was indicating, this will help to open the way for the extreme right and neo-Nazi forces to, much as Trump and MAGA did here, pose as the defenders of the working class and the poor to gain their support. So there's another dimension here to the damage and threats of the increased military spending. Yeah, this was sort of interesting. He talked about NATO Secretary General Rutte saying that NATO is more powerful than any other power in the world has been, including Rome. But then he went on to say Rome was not a defensive alliance, and that NATO is very clearly an aggressive war alliance. And just the history of NATO wars. If you want to go back to Serbia, you want to go back to Libya, and as I did in the talk on global NATO, the increasing European military presence in the Taiwan Strait and in the South China Sea. Then another speaker, there was a Ukraine workshop, and Volodymyr Yushchenko was sort of the central speaker there. He's a leftist Ukrainian sociologist. He's based in Berlin now. And a few of us have read his earlier book called Toward the Abyss, Ukraine from Maidan to War. And from his view, there's no good guys in the Ukraine war. His take is that Ukraine is losing the war and that the EU cannot fully compensate for the loss of US support. He says that Ukraine wants a ceasefire at this point, both because it's losing and it's under pressure from Trump. He is pretty clear that Russia does want to dominate Ukraine and wants to control its foreign policies, although not to absorb the whole country. And he pointed to the fundamentally different demands, negotiating positions of Ukraine and Russia basically saying that they're so totally in opposition to one another that it's unclear what there is to negotiate. And so there's a sense that we're, as he and others said, we're probably in unhappily for a long war. He said, and speaking as a Ukrainian, he said this is not a traditional war of national liberation on their part. He said that most Ukrainians want a continuation of the war, but they're not willing to sacrifice for it. So you have mass desertions, you have mass draft dodging, and he pointed to there have been some anti-conscription riots. So it's a much more complex situation than most of us here in the United States can get from our media. Like I said, there are divisions within Ukraine over why Russia invaded. On the one hand, perception that Russia wanted to erase Ukraine, and on the other hand, pressing back against NATO expansion, which the Russians experienced as a security threat. He did point out that in 2022, there was no immediate danger that Ukraine would join NATO, although the reality is that there was already deepening military integration with NATO militaries training and providing weapons in Ukraine. He said that European elites want Ukraine to become an Eastern European Israel, if you will, a kind of a porcupine barrier to Russia. But he said this requires a lot more funding and support for Ukraine. And the question is whether the Europeans will be willing to provide that. And he also pointed to the reality, which again, we don't see much about here, Ukrainian depopulation. Both before the war, then with the war, millions have left Ukraine. And this further makes it difficult for Ukraine to recruit the forces. I mean, the population is 1/4 the size of Russia, so Russia is better able to mobilize. He pointed to the Istanbul agreement from March 2022 as a foundation for possible future negotiations, and that it's, among other ways, a way to save lives. What else do we have here? Yeah, it was interesting. Again, something we don't see much in our media. He was saying that in the wake of the Soviet Union's collapse, there was essentially a vacuum, a political vacuum in much of Eastern Europe, Russia too, and that this, in part, only in part, was filled with U.S. money to build civil society institutions and movements, but that they weren't grounded. They weren't grounded in the lives and the experience of most people in Eastern Europe and Ukraine. Very top down, very fragile and brittle. And he sees civil society in Ukraine as part of the problem. He also said that Putin's demand for denazification should not be taken at face value. He conceded that, yes, there are some Nazis and extreme right-wing figures, even in the parliament. But he said that they are. This is not the tail that's wagging the dog, but instead we should understand that as code for Ukrainian nationalists, which they'd love to get rid of. So I'm just about here at the end to just say a few things about where we need to go from here in terms of, if you will, the U.S. movement. The European movement is, as Katie said, has its priorities. Obviously, the most immediate thing we have to do is to oust Trump and MAGA from control. But of course, that won't deal with the deeper questions of the U.S. military-industrial complex, the massive military budget, and so on. I guess what I'll point to is the need to respond to calls from Europe and from Asia for solidarity on our part. The 80th anniversary of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki 8 bombing is coming up, and that provides us a huge opportunity to do education and build movement. Palestine, Iran, obviously. So the only other thing to say here is in terms of two other elements related to negotiations. Again, people here in the United States have very little understanding of the OSCE, which was basically the institution and the process through which, the Helsinki process, through which the West and the Soviet Union basically moved to create a European security architecture. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union, much of it was based on common security. We're at the 50th anniversary. They're increasing calls for some kind of renewal of the OSCE. The Russians have their doubts. So it has to be built on trust, but we need to raise that and the common security order that initially followed the collapse of the Soviet Union, as opposed to the question of U.S. dominance. And in negotiations, in addition to our calls for the abolition, acting in solidarity with the Brits and other countries which are now receiving or have received a whole new generation of U.S.-based weapons in Europe. One of the central elements is to oppose new U.S. missiles to Germany. And I think we're going to need to understand that Germany is in this massive transition, and remembering the history from 1872 on, that we have to be concerned about what's going to happen with German and other militarization in Europe. So I'll shut up there. I hope that was at least a little bit helpful, and see where this takes us.
Thank you, Joe. Thanks very much for that global perspective on this problem. And I wonder whether people might have some questions. If you do, for either Kate or for Joseph, or for both of them, you could just go to your React function at the bottom of your screen and raise your hand, and we'll try to move through any questions that people have. Let's start with Timothy Havel. Cole, could you unmute Timothy?
Yes.
Okay, Timothy, you want to ask your question?
I'm going to turn on my. Yeah, my question is, you seem to think that the war in Ukraine can go on for a long time, whatever that may mean. But my understanding is that Ukraine, even at least among those willing to fight, is really running out of manpower. And drones are all very well, but they really can't replace that completely. Either Ukraine is going to have to find somebody willing to commit troops, or I suspect I'm surprised they've held on this long, quite frankly, and I'd be surprised if it went on for much more, another year even. What's your thoughts about that?
Kate, you want to take it?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. I mean, the death toll in the war as a whole has been absolutely phenomenal. Hundreds of thousands, not to mention amputees and terrible injuries. I mean, destruction of infrastructure, lives, livelihoods, destruction of the whole younger generation, mass migration. It's just a devastation for Ukraine, not to mention signing away pretty much lots of their mineral rights to the United States. So it's a kind of asset stripping and destruction of their society. So it's pretty terrible. And I mean, we always feel here, we're very aware that our former Prime Minister Boris Johnson in 2022, he was responsible for telling Zelensky not to enter peace negotiations with Russia at that point, which he was about to do. So there's obviously, it's obvious, I know, but there's interest, there's external interest in maintaining that war and continuing that war, and one has great sympathy with the Ukrainian people for a whole number of reasons, but including the fact that they've really been led into this war, sort of pushed into this war by Western forces, who've just poured in enough money and weaponry to keep them going, and have more deaths and more suffering. So I think that, the sooner it's over, clearly the better, and I think you make a good point there. There's not going to be any kind of breakthrough unless NATO did something extreme, like, I don't know, nuclear attacks or sending in ground troops or something like that, unless there's some massive escalation on the part of the West, then it's going to limp along and more people are going to be killed on both sides. So, yeah, the war has to be brought to an end.
Thank you, Kate. Thanks, Timothy. Next would be Claret Cowell.
I think they just dropped off. They must have clicked the wrong button.
Okay, well,
Just
maybe
as you called on them.
Claret, maybe you want to come back in. We lost you. Let's see, Michael Hoey.
Am I unmuted yet? So my question deals with the increased defense production with the new NATO, what do you call it, where they want to spend so much, like 3.5 on hardware and another 1.5 in ancillary services. So it looks like, based on what I can tell, the Poles are really trying to step up their military production. And Germany is setting up new factories in Ukraine, and the South Koreans are involved in some of this. So what I'm trying to understand, going back a few years, Russia was like one of the major exporters of weapons along with the United States. But now, even though they've changed their economy to a war footing where it's this constant tank production, plane production, all that, they're using most of it domestically. And it looks like some of the Eastern European countries are also ramping up their production to counter the weapons production of Russia. And I'm not sure where this is all going. I mean, 5 or 10 years from now, what it'll look like. But what I'm wondering is, what's going to happen? So say, for example, you could stop the war, but the weapons production is going to keep increasing. I guess Russia's going to need to keep theirs up if they're going to start exporting their weapons again. They have a lot of unfulfilled contracts to numerous countries around the world that want their weapons that aren't getting deliveries. And now you have all these other countries, like especially Poland, but also Western Ukraine, I guess, is turning into a weapons producer. So where will that leave the future of the world?
Okay, I want to take it first.
Okay, thanks very much. Yeah, I mean, very big and important questions, and it has actually been very interesting to watch the development of the Russian economy, and the sort of relative failure of sanctions to damage their economy in the way that the West anticipated or hoped for. I mean, I suppose I would just say there are kind of two opportunity costs to spending on military. One is the cost of what is not going to be spent on social services, on public goods, on developing public infrastructure, on supporting people in their daily needs, all that kind of stuff, which makes life bearable and possibly good even. That's one opportunity cost of military spending. And of course, the other is the opportunity cost of military production. So if factories, resources, manpower is going to be funneled into building weapons, what are they not producing instead? That's the big question. And this whole shift of our societies and our economies from a normal kind of civilian society, you know, with all its kind of complex needs and provisions and culture and education and leisure and so on, health, towards military. You know, that is a big disaster, and he's going to have this knock-on effect. And I mentioned at the start about kind of social decay as a result of the kind of lack of social spending and social tensions arising as a result of that. You know, so there'll be not only a kind of militarization and external wars, you're going to see more conflict internally within states as well.
The only other thing I would add here would be going back to Jeremy Corbyn's talk, and his take that in some ways there are parallels here to the situation before World War One, and when you are building all of these new weapons, the danger that they will be used increases, and so I think this is this is a very serious danger. In addition to all those lost opportunity costs, and and again, as Kate indicated, it will open the way for extreme right-wing increase in power, taking maybe control of more governments.
Yeah, that's an important dimension going on here that maybe sometime in the future we can develop a little bit more. Just what impact this is going to have on the political changes in Europe. Both of you have really touched on it. Harris Grumman has a question.
Sorry, just getting him unmuted, Paul. Here we go.
Okay, we'll be right with you, Harris. Here we go.
Okay, sorry. I'm sorry to hop in front of you, Clorette, but you came just at that awkward moment.
Come back.
One after I speak. Well, one of the William Forrest mentioned this in the chat, and it's really, I mean, the United States has always been, had a bipartisan sort of militarism to it since World War II. I mean, since the success of launching the Cold War by Truman, basically Republican, Democrat, they are all remarkably the same on maintaining a powerful military, while they differ greatly on the welfare spending. And that just, goes on. And of course, we did look to Europe as the place where there were parties and movements, official parties, like the German Social Democrats or, the Greens, even more strongly, one would have thought, and some of the definitely more left-wing parties in other countries of Europe that we look to as really an alternative to that, because they had a pro-welfare point of view and an anti-military point of view, even though they often, weren't as strong on it as we would have liked. But they were there, and I used to follow election results in Europe like some people follow the sports scores. It's like rooting for my pink or whatever you want to call them team. And then there were whole countries like Sweden and Finland and Austria that were they were neutral. So when Biden turned to militarism in a way that actually even shocked me, I couldn't believe that even a Democrat who, with the history of Democratic war machine stuff could go so rapidly into a worldwide militaristic mindset. I thought, well, Europe then did the same. And particularly the parties, especially the parties that I had always supported, the Labor Party, the Green Party, whoever you want to say. I mean, so much so that I wrote an article like a year and a half ago saying, et tu Europa, what have you done to us? How could that have happened? I mean, especially because, they got through the whole Cold War without completely abandoning their principles. And now we're abandoning, this makes the Cold War look mild, because nobody even threw a hand grenade at the Soviet Union during the Cold War. And now we're firing missiles into nuclear facilities, like the bomber, airfields or the radar stations. So I'm wondering if particularly you, Kate, because you're there, but I mean, Joe and I talk about this a lot, could explain how could this have happened?
Okay. Well, yeah, this is something we think about a lot. I mean, taking a slightly long view backwards, I would date the change, the kind of significant change in the kind of Social Democratic Party scene to the end of the Cold War, in fact, and the kind of end of the Soviet Union. And I think it's you know, whatever one thinks about the Soviet Union, it did act as some kind of counterbalancing force, you know, in global politics, you know, rights to the wrongs of it or whatever. And certainly after that point, I suppose maybe there were two things. One is that the theories over here amongst scholars was, you know, the collapse of the Soviet Union and the communist project, as was thought at the time, didn't just affect the kind of far left and the communist movement. It also had a knock-on impact on social democracy, because social democracy in its origins was obviously associated with the kind of the communist movement. And that was the start pretty much of all of the social democratic parties moving away from Keynesian economics and going in the direction of neoliberal economic policies. Certainly that was the case here in Britain under Tony Blair. You know, so by the 1990s, or sort of mid to late 1990s, those parties had abandoned that kind of sort of Keynesian welfare state approach and had gone down the neoliberal economic policy approach. But I think one of the things certainly here in Britain was that even though at certain points the Labour Party here had, you know, embraced, you know, welfare statism and Keynesianism and so on, it had never embraced a kind of pro-peace policy. There were kind of occasional blips around that, but essentially Labour was the party of the introduction of the atom bomb. Labour was the party of the founding of NATO, you know, and it's always been an Atlanticist party. And this kind of minor attempt by Jeremy Corbyn to somehow kind of break that relationship and, you know, policy framework for the Labour Party away from that, you know, was pretty much stamped on. Some people think that's the reason why he was so kind of comprehensively destroyed by, you know, the establishment and the ruling class, you know. But I think it's a pretty complicated thing, and or complex. And what seems to have happened is that, you know, as the situation has got worse, instead of standing, you know, parties to the left, or, you know, or centre left parties standing up and saying, well, actually, there are alternatives to this, they seem to have just swallowed the whole thing lock, stock and barrel. And, you know, we're certainly seeing with Starmer him taking things forward in a worse way than the Tories were before. So in Europe, there are some exceptions, of course. In Spain, for example, Pedro Sanchez, they're a good kind of left, you know, mainstream left government. You know, generally speaking, former Social Democrats have capitulated on all these things, and they're really gung-ho on the military spending. And as someone put in the chat, you know, the Greens have really capitulated. I mean, like the German Greens, you know, in the 80s, they were kind of, you know, great. And then, you know, in the past couple of decades, they've capitulated to the whole war narrative, you know. So why, as there are perfectly good alternatives, you know, and it would be perfectly possible to save economies through red-green economic policy and some judicious planning and nationalisation, and you could deal with all these problems, they won't even go there. You know, it's like they've chucked the whole thing away and they haven't got the courage, even if they still believe in viable alternatives, they certainly haven't got the courage to stand up and fight for them.
Wow. Well, thank you. Yeah. Thanks very much, Kate. Let's take Clarette now. Thanks, Harris. Clarette Kyle.
So I'm a little bit confused by why the peace movement hasn't really defined what they stand for when it comes to peace. And I think that, that is pretty much a large portion of the problem. I mean, Mr. Gerson mentioned that we're seeing the end of colonialism. Well, lo and behold, it's the global South which is trying to redefine the direction of humanity by promoting a new system based on human needs rather than the established parties that have dominated Wall Street, London, and all of that corporate and oligarchical interests. And I think that, the big question is, what are we for? What do we stand for? What do we try to rally the population around in replacing this, genocidal system that, is taking away the lifeblood of society? Why don't we put more effort on the retooling of these armament industries for the general welfare? Why is it that we underplay what we stand for rather than utilizing that as the vehicle through which to really unify the peace movement? So if we're for peace, we should also be for development and for the rights of all people to enjoy, a productive life and to realize their potentialities. So that one question, I just want to also bring people's attention to the flyer, a link I put in there. Don't let the nuclear fireworks spoil your vacation, because this is really on the agenda now. So I would like people to read that flyer. I put the link in there. It's in German and in English. And I just think that we're not doing the job. We're sort of dancing around what we know. Look, Bandung was 1955. That's what the global South wants. And they're basing that on what they saw the West do, the idea of progress. So I don't understand why we don't support a new security and development architecture that everybody can, join hands for, nations as well as individuals. And I just don't get it. I don't know why we hesitate to take lead on that.
Good questions, Clara. Joe, do you want to take a chance whack at that one?
I'll take a shot, but Kate with her role is in a very good position to do this too. So I guess Corette, just say when I gave my talk, I began by talking about the emergence of the global South as a force in the world, and it's certainly at this point, I think, stronger than it was even at the time of Bandung. So I think it's important, and I agree with you that people here need to appreciate what's being called. And the reality is that, like it or not, we're moving to a multipolar world, and the global South is an important part of that. And we see part of its pressure in standing outside, refusing to bless the West portion of the war in Ukraine. They don't bless what Russia's done, but a recognition of the double standards and no longer being willing to be used and exploited in that way. I would say that I think first and foremost here in the United States has to be a struggle against the degree of fascism that we have, which is based in significant measure on the desperate desire to recreate or reinforce white supremacy here, and that affects us all. And white supremacy has been a massive portion of massive driver of U.S. foreign and military policy. Certainly going back to the War of 1898 and ongoing. So I think, and I have to be a little bit encouraged by, if you will, the united front against MAGA, which is not to say that we cease being critical of Democrats, and you see the Democratic Party totally split here. And again, as Kate was pointing to in the beginning, supporting being encouraged by forces like AOC, Mondani, and others. And I think the other thing I'd say is that at least many of us in the peace movement have been committed to trying to create an integrated, issue-integrated movement, as well as a diverse one. So clearly what we stand for is no foreign wars. What we stand for is, no nuclear weapons. What we stand for is in the environment. In my organization, we've been pressing the concept of common security, which goes back to the end of the Cold War, growing out actually of Europe, the concept that no nation, or in fact no people, even within countries, can be secure if their rivals are insecure. So you have the spiraling arms races, or here in the United States, we see what's happening with farms without workers. We're going to see what happens when viruses move to that the elite suffer from viruses and germs just as much as everybody else does. So the idea of pressing for a common security alternative. So I think that's a beginning. Kate?
Thanks, Joe. Kate, do you have want to make a comment on Clarette's?
Yeah, just a quick point. Yeah, Clarette, that's really a strong theme that we have in our meetings here, and people say, you're very clear about what you're against, what are you for? And of course, I mean, that it's kind of, it's understandable to me why that happens, because Joe's just said we're against wars, we're against nuclear weapons, and we're against the genocide, and so those things always seem to be so much, well, they are so urgent to deal with those things. So you're trying to mobilize people to stop something, to stop these terrible things happening. And where do you find that space? Because we're signed up, to the idea of, common security architecture, just exactly what you're saying. I mean, that is exactly what's needed, but it's finding the space, not only in terms of our time and our resources as a movement, but also getting the space in terms of media coverage and, think tanks or whatever, actually being willing to address that. And that's one of the reasons why I put a link in the chat earlier. We produced with academics and trade unionists and experts a thing called the Alternative Defence Review, which was brought out at the same time as our government launched its Strategic Defence Review, saying actually there is a completely different way of doing that. And if you get a chance to have a look, I think you'll find that we've addressed some of your concerns there. Not least the whole thing about, industrial production, and you can produce other things, and workers are happy or even wanting to produce things that aren't weapons of mass destruction and so on. And there's a case in there, for a just transition, and sustainable industrial production and sustainable energy and so on. So that, yes, absolutely, we fight for those alternatives, and getting the space to really clearly articulate them and win people to them is fundamental to what we do.
Okay, thank you, Kate. I just want to ask Joe, and thanks, Clarette. Just want to ask Joe and Kate, I see a few more questions out here, and I have one that I just have to ask. So are you two able to go for another 15 minutes?
Yeah, maximum.
Okay, maybe we can cut it. I'm just going to use the prerogative of the chair. Kate, you mentioned that the biggest, probably the biggest movement right now in Europe is around Gaza, and that in the United States, our peace movement is divided 16 different ways on Ukraine, but it is very focused on what it's about on Gaza and Palestine. And yet, while we speak, the Palestinian population of Gaza is being totally destroyed. And so my question to you is, there some type of collaboration where with these powerful movements in the United States and in Europe and probably other countries too, can somehow coordinate to focus on at least lessening, breaking the blockade of food that Israel is engaged in right now? Is there some type of collaboration that could have some type of impact, given the fact that our governments are absolutely, just traitors to the human race on this? And given how big our movements are, what can we do together to have some type of impact on this?
I'm personally, I am very, very strongly in favor of, and have always argued for, international coordination and international solidarity. I think they're fundamental, not only on this question, but on all political questions, because all the challenges we face today in the world, they can't be resolved on a national basis. The problem is getting people to understand that, and not to just behave or organize in a kind of a relatively parochial or local fashion, to recognize the importance of bringing those big forces to play and coordinating them, right? So that's one thing. I mean, the other thing is really, what are there are many ways of opposing the genocide. There's the kind of legal ways, there's kind of mass mobilization ways, there's boycott, divestment, and sanctions. One of the things that I find most remarkable is when dock workers, as we saw recently in Europe, you've had it in the States in the past, refuse to load boats, ships with military equipment. Should there be a focus on one particular element, or is it all of those elements that we have to systematically work on together on the basis you don't know which will be the last straw that breaks the camel's back? That is the really difficult thing, because in some countries it seems to be more possible for dock workers to take that kind of action, or factory workers to take that kind of action in terms of military production. In other countries, that doesn't even seem to come onto the agenda. So I suppose that's when the kind of national specificity impacts on what you might wish to do collectively internationally. But I think if there was some way of having a much greater dialogue between the movements internationally, then it might be possible to kind of consolidate and maximize what we do individually, as movements individually, I mean. So I think it requires an increased international dialogue between the movements.
Yes, we don't seem to have that infrastructure as much as Joe has been working on it.
Just jump in to say, I think Kate has given us a challenge there in terms of next steps. But the other thing I want to just point out, was discussed very much at the Counter Summit, was the role of South Africa and some other global South countries, who've gone to the International Court of Justice, the ICC, and otherwise. And that kind of courage needs to be, and action needs to be supported. And you hear very little about those dimensions in our movement here, but it needs to be, I think, affirmed. I have to say, see, I'm almost speechless here. I'm Jewish. Defined in many ways by the Holocaust, including the Warsaw Ghetto, and just to my sense, since about October the 8th of 23, has been that what we're witnessing is a variation of what the Nazis did in the Warsaw Ghetto, and it's like shooting fish in a barrel, except that these are human beings. And the imperative for us to find ways to act, I think, cannot be overstated.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. Thank you, Kate. Let's move on to one last question. But let me just say, I think whether it's setting up one international day for all countries to work on that issue of the starvation or the genocide, or whatever. Setting up one tool that we all use. One coordinated petition that involves action. I think something like this is really called for, and I just hope both here in the United States and the movements abroad, given the need for international pressure right now, can come up with some type of idea along those lines. Let's take one last question. I apologize to Karen and Elizabeth. We do have to move along here, but let's take Joan Rousseau's question. Joan has been holding on for quite a while, and this will be our last question. We will be providing people, Joe, I guess, is going to be sending out a recording of today's session if you think that you'd like to share it with friends and colleagues. So Joan, you want to go ahead? Cole, can you find Joan there? Joan Rousseau.
Yeah, Joan, you got a request to unmute. Did you see it? She might have walked away from her computer.
Yes. Okay, am
Okay.
I on?
Yes.
I can hear you out there, Joan.
We hear you, but we don't see your face. But go ahead.
Oh, I know. I have trouble getting my face on.
Okay.
Okay, if I may speak. So
Go ahead.
you know, I have been opposed to NATO since the 60s, and I think this has really disturbed me that so often, even when the wonderful conference that took place in the peace, people are divided about the role of NATO. And I can remember, as I said, I was against it in the 60s. And so what has been ignored is that now we're going to have to, as was pointed out, we're going to have to try to go up to 5% of the military budget, which is certainly a strong point that Kate made. What's going to happen with all the other important things that we have to work on? And so this is just tragic what's happening, and how NATO is not recognized as being the cause or contributing to the war in Ukraine. I mean, what was happening and there was the provocation. They keep saying the attack was without any provocation, and I support strongly the position of common security. I remember when Olaf Palmer presented that at that no one is safe unless everyone is safe, and that is something that Joseph has carried on for years. And I think it's so important that we deal with disbanding NATO, which is destroying, was definitely provoked the war. It was really NATO against Russia. And I don't think the peace movement is recognizing that sufficiently. And there was a buildup of our, because of what happened in 2014, where with the provocation that went on there. And I think it's just disastrous. I can't, the possibility of using 5% of a budget to support NATO and their activities, I think we've got to deal with that. And also we've got to deal with the problem with the United Nations, in that I can remember I was rereading Article 2 of the Charter, and they said that all nations are equal, but as has been said in Animal Farm, but some are more equal than others with the veto, and we've got to keep going after the veto. And it's so important to do that. I mean, it's so hypocritical that you can say that all nations are in the Charter, that the UN is formed recognizing that all I don't have the exact wording, all nations are essentially equal.
Joan,
without
Joan,
realizing that.
Joan, excuse me, Joan, you're raising an awful lot of good points here. And I think we should turn to our commentators here to comment on them, because we are running out of time though. But thanks very much for your points. Joseph or Kate, want to?
Shall I go first, and then Joseph can round off if this is the last one?
Joan, we're going to give answers now. So listen.
Okay. Thanks, Joan. I'm in
Oh, I
sympathy.
gotta go. Am I still on? No, I'll close it.
We're going to comment on your contribution now. I mean, just to say that I 100% agree with your analysis of NATO. It's a global war machine. It's a disaster. There is absolutely nothing good whatsoever about it, you know. And I mean, it grieves me that many people think, oh, well, yeah, we're against nuclear weapons, or we're against the war on this or that, but NATO's a good thing. And here, the government, you know, Tories and Labour, try and package it as if it's some kind of international solidarity organisation or an international humanitarian organisation, all of which is just complete nonsense. You know, it's a global military machine trying to perpetuate and extend the military power of the kind of fading US empire, you know, and it's just going to take us all into a much worse place, you know, if they get the chance. So I think being opposed to NATO clearly and categorically is absolutely fundamental for our work.
Great. Thank you, Kate. Not too many people hear that message these days. Go ahead, Joe. Did you have any last minute thing to say?
Yeah, so, you know, this sounds peculiar, but it made me think about Oreo cookies. In that people have a sense of how something has been marketed. You know, it has the image of what was there in the past, and to appreciate that, as Kate was saying, NATO is a global military alliance. Even as there's so little knowledge about NATO here in the United States, there's even less in terms of understanding it as a global alliance. I mean, with partnerships with Israel, with Colombia, you know, and to look at the doctrines, right? Was it 2011? They adopted the out of area doctrine, committing, you know, not only for the war in Afghanistan, but across the Middle East. And now you have the commitments from the last three NATO summits in terms of NATO's role in containing China and the increasing joint military operations involving especially European navies with the Seventh Fleet. And just to say, the Seventh Fleet has been almost the leading dictator of U.S. Asia policy, you know, for the last 80 years. So we have a lot of work to do, a lot of education, and as well as organizing and mobilization. And just the last thing that I'll say is that, as I say it from time to time, is that what's essential is that if we say that life is most precious to us, if we say that human rights is most precious to us, then the question is, what is it that we do day to day? Where is it that we put our energies? Where is it we put our money? And so let me appeal to those who are still on this webinar to look deeply. A number of you who are on this have been doing it day to day, others maybe not. And the only way we build is by building. Take care.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Kate. Thanks a million. Thank you, Joseph, for all the insights and information you've given us. We will be sending out Joe will be sending out the recording of this important program. And I think a key lesson here that we're touching on is that opposition to NATO has to be integrated into the agenda of the peace movement in the United States, which it is not right now. And so there is a challenge to us to expose this war machine for what it is. So thanks, everybody.
This
luck.
is just to thank Kate for hanging in with her changes, and Paul for filling in here. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you,
Thanks.
thank you, Kate. I think you can go finally now, Kate.
Thanks.
I
Bye-bye.
think you may have other things to do.